Could we take seats so we can begin? On behalf of the Human Rights Campaign's members and supporters across the country and our current and former board members and supporters here in the room, I want to welcome you. We're very pleased to be here at the LGBT Center of New York. Also very pleased to be here with our partners from NYTAG and the ACLU, SAGE, and LinkedIn on our panel today. We are so proud to have a champion of equality here today with us. Chairman Nadler represents New York's 10th Congressional District. It encompasses a lot of parts of the city, and I worry if I name all of them, I'll miss something and somebody from the audience will come up here and grab the mic. But I want to point out that it does encompass the center, and it also encompasses part of the history that we're celebrating this week with 50 years of Stonewall riots and the Stonewall Inn. So as we gather, we want to remember why we're here this week and why we're celebrating this amazing historic Pride this weekend. In the early morning hours of June 28, 1969, the Stonewall riots began, helping ignite the modern LGBTQ rights movement and harness the political power of LGBTQ people. Harassed by local police simply for congregating, Stonewall's LGBTQ patrons, most of whom were trans women of color, decided to take a stand and fight back against the brutal intimidation they regularly faced. 1 year later, the first LGBTQ Pride marches were held, establishing June as Pride Month. And during the better part of a decade, other demonstrations, gatherings, riots took place to demand LGBTQ rights, including Cooper Donuts many years before, Compton's Cafeteria, and the Black Cat protests of '67. In recent years, the LGBTQ community has made great strides. We have made great strides towards full equality in the US through legal victories and political change built on decades of grassroots activism. And just last month, Chairman Nadler helped shepherd the Equality Act and the passage through the US House by a bipartisan vote of 236 to 173. And this vote marks the first time in the history of our country that a chamber of Congress has passed comprehensive LGBTQ non-discrimination protections. It is historic. Now, it's not the first time that Chairman Nadler has been a chairman. He served as chairman and ranking member of the Subcommittee on the Constitution, Civil Rights, and Civil Liberties for over a decade. He has been a lifelong champion of LGBTQ equality, including during his time in the New York State Assembly. The list of accomplishments and engagements are long. I want to hit a few highlights. He was a leader in the fight to pass the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act. He opposed Don't Ask, Don't Tell and strongly supported the repeal. He currently supports open transgender service in our military. He opposed the Defense of Marriage Act and was the lead sponsor of legislation to repeal it. He was a leader to block the federal marriage amendment, which would have banned marriage equality in every state. He also championed the Uniting American Families Act, which would have allowed same-sex couples to sponsor a partner for immigration prior to marriage equality, and while DOMA was still law. So please join me in welcoming a champion for our community who continues to lead and forge a path for equality all across this country. Please join me and give a warm welcome to Chairman Jerry Nadler.
Thank you, Jody, for that introduction. First, let me say happy Pride. It's very exciting to be here with all of you to celebrate this year. As we remember and recognize the Stonewall Uprising's 50th anniversary, I can't help but express how proud I am to have such an integral part of American history in my district. It's a legacy I try to live up to every day. When I'm at the Capitol, I like to remind my colleagues that much of the history of the United States, and this is a staple in one of my speeches, much of the history of the United States has been a history of expanding the definition of who is understood to be included in the Declaration of Independence declaration that all men are created equal. In our day-to-day lives, it's very easy to forget that when these words were first written in 1776, they did not include black men who were slaves. They didn't include Latino men, didn't include Native American, did not include women, did not include, for that matter, white men without property, and it certainly didn't include LGBTQ individuals. But we have, over time and through great effort, expanded the definition of who we considered equal. And that struggle continues. We have much further to go until all of us are free. None of us are free. There can be no exception that excludes transgender women of color, or same-sex couples, or homeless youth from those who we consider equal. All must be considered equal. All are equal. For Stonewall's 50th, we should take a moment to remember that it has been the Martha P. Johnsons of the world, the Sylvia Riveras of the world, the Audre Lordes of the world, who stood up and showed the rest of America the way. This year, as chair of the House Judiciary Committee, it was my great honor to hold the first ever hearings in Congress on a comprehensive LGBTQ civil rights bill, to preside over the markup when we reported the bill to the floor, and to control the debate on the floor when we passed the bill. Sometimes it gets lost in the near onslaught of scandals from this administration, so I want to be clear when I say it. The House of Representatives passed H.R. 5, the Equality Act, the first ever comprehensive LGBTQ civil rights legislation to even get a vote in either chamber, and we passed it. It is a huge milestone and a huge accomplishment that would not have been possible without the years of advocacy by many of the people in this room, and many of those who have come before us, including those at the Stonewall Uprising itself. The Equality Act is important not just because it extends civil rights protections to the LGBTQ community, but also because of the way it does so. Rather than create a new area of law that would almost certainly face lawsuits that would immediately seek to chip away at its protections, we designed the bill to expand our existing laws. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 is a sacrosanct piece of American law, and given its importance, there was reluctance from many, to open it up to amendment. There was reluctance from many people in the civil rights community to say that once you start opening the Civil Rights Act to amendment, who knows what amendments will be proposed. We all know that any chance the Republican Party has to undermine civil rights protections for anyone who isn't straight, white, and male, they will take it to the fullest extent possible. But ultimately, it became clear that there was no other way. People live unified lives, and their experiences cannot be broken out based on various legal categories. All forms of discrimination are tied together, and we must address them together. If a black lesbian couple is denied housing they are otherwise qualified for, it is nearly impossible to tell if they were turned away because of their race, their gender, or their sexual orientation. The Equality Act recognizes this and makes clear that none of these are acceptable forms of discrimination. I will say that one incredibly interesting fact of the debate, both in the committee and on the floor, and a testament to the LGBTQ's community movement, was how absolutely weak and narrow the Republican arguments were against it. Now, you may remember that as recently as, 15 years ago, 2004, the Republicans, the Bush administration, arranged to have amendments on the ballot, anti-marriage amendments on the ballot, to bring out the vote against Democratic candidates and against other things. But nobody argued this year against gay rights or against lesbians. None of them argued against protections for gay, lesbian, and bisexual people. They focused on transgender people. One would have thought from listening to the debate that they were all fine, except for transgender equality. Republicans picked on 2 points. The first was the same tired and endlessly disproven arguments that somehow transgender people are a dangerous threat when they need to go to the bathroom. And honestly, I will never understand why they think public bathrooms are some great social mixer where people should be concerned about each other's business. It was particularly strange to watch the Republicans make their other major argument, that somehow the Equality Act, because of its inclusion of transgender individuals, would undermine women's sports. It was refreshing to see that the Republicans cared for women's sports. Not only are they not noted champions of Title IX or of women's rights, athletic or otherwise, but they wanted to pick on high school athletes who did nothing more than win. The truth is that these protections existed in various states for decades without undermining women's sports, and there's no reason to expect them to suddenly do so now. And no athlete's occasional success should be used as a roadblock to advancing civil rights legislation for LGBTQ people or for transgender people. In the end, the bill passed with every Democratic member and 8 Republican members voting in support. That's what passes for bipartisan these days. Every Democratic member and 8 Republicans in the House voted for it. I want to make sure to thank HRC, along with many other organizations in the coalition. They were instrumental in making sure we were prepared to defend against every attack and proactively get our message out there. No major piece of civil rights legislation has ever made it through into law on the first try. And unfortunately, there is little hope that Senator McConnell will permit the Senate to even consider the Equality Act. But by passing it, we are actively teeing it up so that the moment the political stars align, when we recapture the Senate and the White House, hopefully a year and a half from now, we can finally make it law. There are a lot of items beyond the Equality Act that need our attention as well. Trump and his administration are actively trying to undermine LGBTQ people's place in our country everywhere they can. In schools, in the military, in hospitals, in homeless shelters, you name it. They're trying to make it more difficult for people to simply live their lives. They're even trying to undermine agencies' ability to acknowledge the LGBTQ community exists, undermining data collection on teen crime victims and seniors. I could go on and on. Do not doubt that every action is on a list somewhere. What the Trump administration is doing is immoral, and we're going to keep fighting them every step of the way. And we're going to reverse all of them right back the first chance we get. Woo! But I want everyone to know this, that right now, despite the horrific things this administration is doing and attempting to do, support for the LGBTQ community in Congress has never been higher. We have more out members than ever, and we've moved the country in a real way. And the fact that I mentioned a few minutes ago that the Republicans in opposing the Equality Act in committee and on the floor did not argue in any way against gay rights, it's generally understood, only on transgender. That is progress. It would have been very difficult 10 or even 5 years ago. I am sure that some of the panelists here today are going to talk about some of the spectacular wins they have achieved at the state level. And next year we need to bring that energy again to the federal level. I was thrilled when I heard that gender finally passed in Albany, and huge progress was made on repealing the loitering law that was used to discriminate against transgender women. There's a lot of work left to be done. Together we can make sure that we're celebrating the signing of federal laws as well soon. Thank you, and happy Pride.
before I turn to a video that we want to share and open up our panel, I do want to thank Chairman Nadler one more time for his being with us here today and for his leadership to help bring our rights to fruition in this country. I did want to point out, it was mentioned to me that we have a special guest in the audience, and there may be multiple special guests, but I was handed a note that Monica Helms from Georgia, who is the creator and founder of the trans flag, is in the audience with us. Monica, where are you? Monica! All right, Monica. And also, Monica has two other claims to fame, is the founder of the Transgender American Veterans Association, and also will serve as one of the Grand Marshals at Sunday's Pride Parade. So welcome, Monica. So Shia Diamond is somebody who's been a leader and a voice emerging in the last couple of years, but on the ground in her community for many, many years. At HRC and across our movement, we know that policies are critically important, but hearing directly from those most impacted by discrimination is truly how we make change. And so with that in mind, we worked with artists, actors, athletes, and others to share what the Equality Act would mean to them individually. And today we want to share one of those videos with you from Shia Diamond. She is an incredible performance artist and trans advocate. Let's take a look and hear more from her.
I'm Shia Diamond, and I'm proud to be an American for the Equality Act. I'm a Southern woman from the dirt roads of Little Rock, Arkansas. I realized there were no protections for people like me there. And I knew California and New York, they were cutting edge. They've always been fighting. I've known about them since I was little, a little young queer. And I was like, oh yeah, New York. And back in the South, I was just singing my head off. And nobody would see anything besides my queerness. They wouldn't hear my talent. They wouldn't hear my songs. And it was like going to New York and having the opportunity there that I realized that some states actually fight for the protections of other people. As an artist, as a singer-songwriter that travels a lot, it's imperative that when I go to your state that I have rights, or I can't come to your state and perform. When I go into these places, I know what I'm going to experience. I'm going to experience some type of violence, whether it's going to be misgendered, harassed, whether somebody's going to throw their Bible at me and tell me that I don't have the same God-given rights as everyone else because I don't look like everyone else, or I don't express myself like anyone else, that my gender expression looks different. It's imperative that there is some law put into place protecting not only me, but people who look like me and experience the same experience. There has to be something put into place that says this is not okay. And this is it. This is what we need. Passing the Equality Act sends a powerful message to our LGBT youth that they are affirmed, welcomed, and protected. Join me in the human rights campaign in this fight.
I want to thank the participants here with us today and for the audience for joining in this critical and important discussion on this historic weekend. Today we want to hear from movement leaders about how far we have come since Stonewall, but also remind ourselves how far we still have to go to win full legal equality. The past 50 years have seen incredible advances in acceptance and legal protections for our community. Over that time, we've seen public acceptance grow, really truly one of the fastest growing acceptances and movements of any movement in this country in the last 5 decades. Same-sex relationships legalized in the 2003 Lawrence v. Texas decision, marriage equality across multiple decisions, open military service for LGB people, with the 2010 Don't Ask, Don't Tell repeal, and more than, actually almost 1,000 openly LGBTQ elected officials serving at all levels of government, including governors, attorneys general, and Congress in this country. State and local legal protections. And in corporate America, they are leading in providing non-discrimination and benefits for their employees. But despite these incredible gains, as a movement and as an LGBTQ community, we still have work to do. Around 50% of the LGBTQ Americans, approximately 8 million people, live in states that still lack statewide legal protections, leaving their residents and visitors at risk of discrimination because of who they are or whom they love. No one's civil rights should depend on the state or the zip code in which you live. If I were to get in a car in Maine and take a cross-country trip, my rights change depending upon what state I'm in or where I'm staying or where I decide to hang out my shingle. The harsh reality is that discrimination is real, and it is a persistent problem for LGBTQ people across the country. Nearly 2/3 of LGBTQ people have reported experienced discrimination in their everyday lives. So as we open today's panel, we will hear some of the stories of progress, we will hear some of the personal stories, and we will discuss the path for full legal equality in this country. So I want to introduce our panelists, and then I'll join them as we have our discussion. So first to my left, Melissa Scalars, certainly a friend to the New York LGBTQ community and such a leader for transgender rights in this state and nationally. She also has a couple of firsts. First, New York transgender person elected to the Democratic National Committee as a delegate, and the first American to actually serve as an openly transgender person in the Electoral College.
I tried voting twice, it didn't work.
She has taken on a new role at SAGE in their government relations team, but truthfully, those of us in the community know her as a relentless leader who will fight to the end to get protections passed and be there to lock arms and celebrate with all of us when we are successful. So we welcome Melissa to the panel today. Next, Rosanna DeRuthi. Rosanna comes as a leader in LinkedIn's senior team. She is the global head of diversity, inclusion, and belonging at the company. She has also been just a community leader and advocate in her own right. And there are days when I've worked with Rosanna where I don't know for sure if she's actually going to work or if we're just going to meetings together to advance LGBTQ equality. She has also served on HRC's Business Advisory Council, and she is somebody who is sought out by many to get their advice as to what more their company or their organization can do for equality. So Rosanna, we welcome you. James Essex is the director of the ACLU's LGBT and HIV project based here in New York. He has decades as a leading legal scholar and litigator and advocate for our community. He served on counsel for the Obergefell v. Hodges, the U.S. v. Windsor decision, and the Gavin Grimm case. Those are only a few. There are many others. But he's also such a great partner in the ongoing work for the Equality Act, and we will hear more from James today. So thank you for your partnership, James, and thank you for being here today. James Essex. Our movement would not have success across states or federally without leaders in communities like Tanya Walker. Tanya is the co-founder and community affairs officer at NYTAG. She has been a leader for so many issues here in the state of New York and the community of New York City. She also is a veteran of the U.S. Army, and she received training in the military that truly, as she would say, prepared her to be a fierce advocate and defender of freedom, particularly for transgender New Yorkers. She has been somebody on the front lines for many, many years, and her voice is echoed across many of the successes that we have seen, and we welcome her voice to the panel today. Thank you so much, Tanya, for being here. So as we open our panel, and we do want to make sure that we highlight the legal protections and sort of the state of play, if you will, here in the country, I want to turn to you, James, in terms of kind of setting some of that context for us. Obviously, the chairman was very helpful with this as well, and so knowledgeable in terms of what has transpired on the front lines. But as we think about these last decades and what we have seen in terms of change and advancement, we also know that with this president and vice president and their administration, we have seen rollbacks, and there also are threats in the courts. Could you tell us sort of, I don't know, in a couple minutes, James? No. What are some of the keys about the movement forward, but what are the current threats, especially in the courts? And then, of course, if you can, give us a little hope, James, give us the Equality Act and your take there, too. So why don't you kick us off?
Sure. Thank you, Jody, and it's such a pleasure to be here to talk with all of you. As Jody asked about, talking a little bit about history and progress, and Congressman Nadler has talked some about progress, and I think we know a bunch of progress. I think it's helpful to just give some bullet points about what the world looked like in 1969 for the LGBTQ community. In '69, every state other than Illinois made same-sex intimacy a crime, and there were prosecutions under those laws. The federal government still explicitly barred gay people from government jobs, and thousands of people were chased out of their federal jobs because of that ban. Police routinely raided places where LGBTQ people congregated, often bars and other places as well. The New York State Liquor Authority had, until just recently, in '69, forbidden bars from serving anybody who was a homosexual. They would lose their liquor license if they showed that they were serving gay people. New York City had laws against cross-dressing, and they were enforced. Family court judges regularly took kids away from the parents when the parents came out as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender. And the federal government barred foreigners, quote, afflicted with sexual deviation, close quote, from being eligible to immigrate into the United States. And the American Psychiatric Association still classified lesbian, gay, and bisexual people as having a mental disorder. So that is a very different landscape than where we are today. And while there are very serious problems that we are still facing, the fact that people were out and about and active and making noise and making change in 1969, that's a much bigger thing than what it is for any of us today to do those same things. So kudos to the people who had the inner strength to do that. And obviously some of those problems continue, especially the epidemic of violence against trans people, and especially black trans women in all parts of the country. But there is one thing, and so we've made progress on many things, marriage equality, et cetera, but there's one thing that we haven't achieved at the federal level, which is what we're talking about today, which is comprehensive non-discrimination protections for LGBTQ people. And we need those protections because we know that the discrimination is something that is a real thing that affects our community in so many different ways. At the ACLU, we get letters and emails and calls from people every day telling us about the problems that they face because of their sexual orientation, gender identity, or expression. The primary way to get the civil rights protections that we need is to pass a new law through Congress, and that's the Equality Act that Congressman Nadler, Chairman Nadler, was talking about. A bill called the Equality Act was first introduced in 1973. The bill that it was just reintroduced and first introduced in Congress in 2015 is a much improved, much expanded, much more inclusive bill. As Chairman Nadler said, it would amend the existing Civil Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which is the main Civil Rights Act in our federal civil rights system, to add in sexual orientation and gender identity as parts of the definition of sex. It would add protections for LGBTQ people in the context of employment and housing and education and credit and jury service. So that's the first thing it would do, add LGBTQ people into the existing act. The second thing that it would do is it will fill gaps that exist in federal civil rights laws, not just for LGBTQ people, but for women. The current ban on discrimination by businesses open to the public, it doesn't bar sex discrimination. That's an appalling gap that should have been filled a long time ago. The Equality Act would fill that so that sex discrimination, including sex discrimination that affects LGBTQ people, would be unlawful. And that would cover public accommodations. It would also fill a gap in the ban on discrimination by recipients of federal funds. So right now, if you get a contract or a grant from the federal government, it comes with strings, non-discrimination strings. Those strings currently don't bar sex discrimination. That's a gap that the Equality Act would fill. And the last thing the Equality Act would do is it would expand the definition of the businesses that are covered by the ban on discrimination, not just against LGBTQ people, but again, based on race, sex, national origin, religion, and sex. And so that means that currently retail stores are not covered by the federal ban on discrimination. So the problem that some people have shopping while black, being harassed by people in the stores because of race discrimination, that is currently lawful under federal law because federal law doesn't cover retail stores. That would be fixed by this law. And the other thing that the law would add is transportation providers. Taxis. Discrimination in taxis, anybody? Yes, that's a thing that happens. Trains, airlines, they would be covered for race, color, national origin, religion, sex, including LGBT people. That's a bill that adds us into the Civil Rights Act and fixes a bunch of problems that should have been fixed a long time ago in the civil rights laws. And that, as Chairman Nadler said, passed in the House in May, and we are in the process of building support for it so that it can pass in a new Congress in the Senate. But the last thing I want to cover is that there is another path to non-discrimination protections for our community, which is through the courts. The Equality Act adds LGBT people in by recognizing that the ban on sex discrimination includes discrimination based on sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, and some other things. That's because there has been a growing recognition by federal agencies and by the federal courts that the existing bans on sex discrimination in various parts of federal law cover discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. And the Equality Act mirrors that, and these protections that are out there are part of what the Trump administration is doing, the protections that the Trump administration is determined to take away from our community are largely protections that are based on sex discrimination. So they're trying to take away protections under the Affordable Care Act that have helped transgender people get access to transition-related care in states across the country. They're trying to take that back, and that's based on sex discrimination. They are trying to take back protections that people currently enjoy in terms of access to homeless shelters. Those are sex discrimination-based protections, and the Trump administration has proposed a rule to gut those protections. There are also protections based in the Fair Housing Act based on sex discrimination that are currently being used by LGBTQ people. This is coming to a head, this question about are the courts going to continue to recognize, or are the courts going to roll back protections that our community has under the bans on sex discrimination? It's going to come to a head in the U.S. Supreme Court probably about a year from now. In April, the U.S. Supreme Court granted review in 3 different cases that are all about, does it violate federal law to fire people because they're trans or because they're gay, lesbian, or bisexual under the federal ban on sex discrimination? Let me tell you 2 quick stories. One is about Amy Stevens. Amy worked for a funeral home just outside of Detroit for 6 years. And they knew her as a guy, but she had known since she was 5 years old that she was a woman. And she finally gathers the courage to come out to her boss as a woman, says that she's going to come to work in professional attire because they had a dress code. And of course, you know what happens next. She gets fired. And she sues, and the federal appeals court in the middle of the country in Cincinnati says, yep, firing Amy Stevens because she's trans is a form of sex discrimination. She can sue over that. The Supreme Court has taken that case. The second story is about Don Zorda. Don lived out on Long Island. He was a skydiving instructor at a small outfit out there. And when a customer found out that he was gay and the customer complained to management, Don gets fired. He too goes and sues and says, hey, this is a form of sex discrimination. That shouldn't be able to happen to me. And the federal appeals court sitting here in New York City said, yep, that's right. You can't, firing somebody because they're lesbian, gay, or bisexual is a form of sex discrimination. The Supreme Court has taken that case as well. And so these cases will be argued in the fall, probably in October. The decisions will probably come out in May or June of next year. And we obviously are advocating very strongly that the court agree with the lower courts that these protections exist and that they don't take the protections back. But how do those cases fit with the Equality Act? Well, look, if we win those cases and we have protections based on sex discrimination, that will mean we have protections in many different contexts, but not all contexts, because remember, I talked about the fact that we need the Equality Act to fill some gaps. There is no sex discrimination protection in the context of public accommodations or federally recipients of federal funds. And so we don't get those protections unless we pass the Equality Act. So even if we win these cases, we still need to pass the Equality Act. And if we lose these cases, and I have to tell you, it is entirely possible that we lose these cases because the Supreme Court has changed in a way that is very disturbing. If we lose these cases, our community will have been robbed of protections that we have been using for a long time. And we should be very angry about that, and we will need to pass the Equality Act. So win or lose, we're gonna need the Equality Act. We may get some protections, some important protections through the Supreme Court.
Thanks so much, James. I did want to take a quick minute to introduce a couple folks in the audience. I see that the co-chair of the Human Rights Campaign's board, Deb Taft, has joined us at the back of the room. Welcome, Deb. Thanks for being here. Thanks for everything you do for us. We appreciate it greatly. And I hope he's still in the room. But we had joined us the Lieutenant Governor of Guam, Joshua Tenorio, who was the first openly gay lieutenant governor in the country. Now, he was here for a few minutes, and I'm not sure, he might have had to leave. He must have had to leave. But we acknowledge him. Let's clap for him in absentia. There you go. I bet you're going to see him somewhere at Pride. So now, Rosanna, I want to turn to you. Companies like LinkedIn have often been both quietly and loudly on the front lines of fighting for equality. Tell us why corporate voices are so important in this fight and what you've observed in your leadership roles.
I think we've all heard and we're well aware of the changes that we've seen over the last 20 years or so in relation to LGBTQ equality. And in many ways, corporations are like the superfood in the equality fight, where our legislators have failed us, where the judiciary on occasion has ruled against the LGBT community. What we've seen is that corporations have recognized that their employees are the difference makers in their ability to serve customers, grow their businesses, create environments that enable people to be productive and successful. But at the core of that productivity and success is the freedom and the peace of mind of employees who have the ability to live their lives. And where our government hasn't always stepped in, corporations have progressively stepped into the space, whether it's offering equality of benefits for employees, providing protections in the workplace, not only here in the United States, but around the world, often enabling people to be themselves, ironically, at work, even when they couldn't be themselves in their own home communities and towns. And for a company like LinkedIn, it means a great deal. Our vision is to create economic opportunity for every member of the global workforce. And we recognize that that is not possible if people don't feel the sense of security, the well-being, the ability to pursue a productive, successful life in their authentic way, regardless of their race, their gender identity, or their sexual orientation. Companies like LinkedIn and Microsoft, among many others who have signed on to the Equality Act, are companies that recognize that creating a society where people have the freedom to live their lives is about creating a society where we have the ability to not only be authentically ourselves, but to create environments where we grow healthy, happy, and productive. And with that, we also recognize that the need to feel safe and secure is a basic human right. There shouldn't be a group of people, most certainly not any community, where we feel at risk in order to fulfill our needs, in order to provide for our families, in order to participate in our communities. And thankfully, as we see that 85% of the Fortune 500 recognizes the importance of providing benefits for their LGBT employees, and even more so, lending a voice to conversations like this, lending their social capital and their influence in the chambers of the legislature here and abroad, we recognize that much of the work that we've seen that has led to the progress we've made has come with that powerful ally by our side, speaking up in places where we are sometimes not allowed to enter, and certainly advocating for us by providing opportunities. And while there's more work to be done, certainly the example that's been set by corporations to be more inclusive, I think, has changed the game. I certainly know that in my own life, I probably wouldn't have imagined being a corporate executive, much less as a lesbian woman, but certainly as a Black woman, as a Latina woman, it just didn't seem viable or feasible. And to have the opportunity to engage in the kind of work that I do on a day-to-day basis with the caliber of leaders that I work with, where we're all in this together, it really does make a great distinction in terms of seeing how companies can step into the space of influencing and working alongside people like Chairman Nadler to continue advancing not only the opportunities for us to live our fulfilled lives, but for us to be ourselves in this life.
Thank you so much for that. Now, I have to tell you that for Melissa and Tanya, I had you each sit on an end because I consider you the anchors of our panel. Mm-hmm. And as we hear from you, both in terms of what you've seen as change in the community over time in this historic period, but personally in terms of the challenges you have faced, and as we see on a close horizon, hopefully, that we can get legal protections, but we know there will be more work to do even as you get to those places. Please share with us some of your thoughts about this progress and the challenges ahead. And I'll go to you first, Tanya, and then Melissa will have you next.
Well, I fought for gender protections in New York State for like 17 years. First, we fought for Sonda, we fought on Sonda, and we got kicked off of Sonda, and then so we created Agenda, and we fought for 17 years. I've experienced most of my discrimination in healthcare. I'm a 2-time lung cancer survivor and an Army veteran, and I was at the hospital here in New York City, Memorial Sloan Kettering, and I was misgendered, harassed, and made to bleed through a catheter, and I wasn't taken care of very well. It was a lot of discrimination going on at the hospital, because currently we need more transgender people in positions of power. We need them on boards. We need them working everywhere. We need them in Congress. We need them, in government positions, because we're not fully protected without that. I mean, I hear LGBT all the time, but the T appears to be silent. My sisters are suffering. I think we had 11 trans women murdered, probably more, that weren't reported. However, I know several who are unemployed and who are forced into survival sex work and who are being harassed and discriminated in the jails and prisons of New York State, city and state. And things haven't really gotten much better for Black trans women. I can speak for, and I don't think it's gotten better for trans women of color. it's a, you know, a revolutionary act for me to walk out the door and come here every day. My life is in danger. You know, I'm gaymous, which is gay famous, but my life is in danger just coming out the door, you know, living my authentic self. And my experience, again, I'll go back to Memorial Sloan Kettering. The social workers told me she would call me what she sees me as. She didn't see me as a woman. She took away my right to self-determine my own gender. That's a particular problem we're having in New York City. Most of the agencies in New York City do not understand what protections trans people have, and so we're still being misgendered, and we're still being harassed, you know, in accommodations, and specifically in the healthcare system. They just refuse to respect our gender identity. They will not call us she and her. I mean, I know it's conservative and they're slow to change, but they need to really be educated about, you know, our rights in New York City and in New York State, so that everyone will be safe. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanya. Melissa?
Tanya, New York loves you. Who are you kidding? So picture this, Albany, December 2002, nasty. Signed to pass the Sexual Orientation Non-Discrimination Act, and everyone's very happy. Gay and lesbians get their civil rights. We spent 4 years, transgender New Yorkers, trying to change the language to be inclusive. We were a small, emerging minority within the gay and lesbian movement, but we thought it was important that the language reflect our realities. We did everything we could, and we got traction in the Democratic Conference, who were the minority in those days. When it came time for a floor vote, we got nowhere. The Republicans in the majority literally turned their back to us. A deal had been made. Governor Pataki signed the bill, and gays and lesbians got civil rights in New York. It was a game changer for gay and lesbian rights in New York. It was a profound change and led to marriage equality years later. And so we sat in a room, a small group of us, and go, oh my God, now what are we gonna do? And Charles King, the founder of Housing Works, said simple, we will create our own standalone transgender bill. And Joanne Principali says, great, and I'll write it. And I said, you two are idiots, it'll never happen. Always the optimist. And that started our journey in December 2002 for Transgender Civil Rights and Gender Expression Non-Discrimination Act. And Tanya mentioned it, and you know, the two of us, we can talk about some of the stories, the different strategies we had. How is this tiny minority in the gay and lesbian movement going to go to Albany, be taken seriously? How are we going to grow our coalition? How are we going to create a winning strategy? What needs to be said? Who needs to say it? Who are going to be the voices and the faces? What stories will resonate? Interesting, as we got to about year 15 or 16, they began to just ignore people like Tanya and me. But now we were seeing parents of trans children, and the Republicans went, ugh. And this was a story that seemed to resonate with them, to hear these parents from all over the state going, this is something we neither asked for or expected, and yet happened. Of course, as we all know, the way to get civil rights is to get rid of the Republicans. And lo and behold, that's what happened. So the amount of work and effort, Tanya used to drive the bus. It was just crazy. So fist fights in the back, crazy stories. To be here today with HRC, with my friends, and with our friends in the LGBT community, celebrating 50 years of Pride is awesome. You know, Tanya talks about her story about being trans in New York. My experience is sort of similar, but sort of different. And I started on my physical transition and hormones in 1991. I told someone at work, and within 2 weeks I was fired. And I did not find a full-time permanent job again for about 6 years. And of course that was the 90s. But you know what? I still take a look today, and we talk about words like homophobia and transphobia. You know, Tanya and I are both from New York. It's not a coincidence that we're here, and we live in our New York blue bubble. But I look around, I've done enough work here. I was National Stonewall Democrats. I've traveled the country for LGBT people and to make the Democratic Party more LGBT inclusive. And the one barrier that always seems to come up again and again, wherever, however, whenever, is race. And you know, Tanya can tell a story and I can tell a story, and we both have our trans experience, and the story be completely different. And whether you're trans, whether you're gay and lesbian or not, you know, there's always going to be that barrier and boundary of race that affects everything. And that includes these struggles. And it's so important, really, that our organizations really acknowledge that, you know, LGBT people reflect America, and America has a serious race problem. And so it's great that I've been able to use my privilege and access to bring the work to this moment, and now it's time for a new generation of fierce fighters, and I'll use my experience and support. And Congressman Nadler talked about that couple, that black lesbian couple, trying to get rights with the Equality Act. Well, what if they're in their 70s? So Sage was involved in writing the Equality Act. It was very important to us. I mean, we were the tail of the dog, for sure. But it was very important that the Equality Act include protection for aging LGBT people. You know, there was a time, we all remember, or those of us of a certain age, in the 80s and the 90s, where people were dying horribly. And now that's not happening as much. You know, there are miracles in healthcare and miracles of access. And so we're all going to be aging if we're lucky. And it's very important that our laws protect us, not only if we're black or white or LGBT, but also as we're over 70, over 80, and over 90. We've done the studies, HRC has helped, SAGE has done it. You know, the Older Americans Act, what is it like going to Washington, D.C.? Think of all those same struggles and trying to convince all these Southern senators that not only should they protect older people, but they should protect older LGBT people, and their eyes glaze over. I recognize that glaze. And so the Older Americans Act, and Lamar Alexander, Republican from Tennessee, is leaving because you can only work with Trump for so long. So he's leaving the Senate, and he wants the Older Americans Act to pass and get funded. But to include LGBT people is going to be a heavy lift. That's where the Equality Act comes in. It's going to be our best shot as LGBT people, as of elders, that if we want to be protected in America, we see what Donald Trump is doing. It's hard to know what he really cares about. He doesn't really seem to care much about anything. But his people want to divide us. They want to take the marginalized, smallest minorities, pick them off, whether you're Muslim or Mexican or trans. And if he wins with all that, he's coming for gays and lesbians next, and then who knows. The Equality Act is going to be our hope. It's going to be what's going to protect us against the vagaries of a political system with terrible, terrible leaders whose idea of America that makes sense is the 1890s. And you know, we're lucky to have people like Jerry Nadler, who now has a voice. And now we have an upcoming election. And not only is it going to require all of us to stand up and change the direction of our American system, but it's going to take our friends and our families, our allies and our neighbors. You know, our democracy, our freedom as an LGBT culture is at stake. As a transgender woman watching this man and his allies take our rights away, you know what I'm saying is true. So thanks.
Thanks so much, Melissa. Now, I understand that the Lieutenant Governor of Guam heard that you cheered so loudly for him that he came back into the room. So, Lieutenant Governor Joshua Tenorio, are you in the room? There we are. I told them that they would see you out at Pride somewhere if they weren't going to see you here, but thank you again for joining us. I do want to turn to the audience and see if we have a couple of questions for the panel. We've heard so much texture about what's happened here in the state of New York and across the country, the challenges ahead, the opportunities, the foundation that has been built by so many of you here in the room. Do we have a couple of questions, perhaps, for the panel? I see one over here to the right.
Hi, Dan Teets. This is Ray.
Dan
I really
Teets.
appreciate all of
Can you stand, Dan?
Stand, Dan.
Thank you.
I really appreciate all of your remarks. I wanted to turn to something that Tanya spoke to, I think, most directly, but I think to some degree a couple of others did as well, which was, so now we passed gender in New York, and it's not as though people are going to magically know that, are going to magically know what was included there. What would you suggest are the next steps in terms of, and maybe this is for James as well, really, about implementation, about where do we go to make sure that those healthcare providers or educators or this business happens to know that the law now says this and this are illegal.
Tanya?
Well, New York Transgender Advocacy Group we created a Know Your Rights training so that we can train different organizations and folks throughout New York State about the law so that they won't discriminate, and also people will know their rights. It's very important that, since gender passed, I believe, it was on January 15th of 2019, and on the 25th, it was signed into law, I think in this room, by Governor Cuomo. And so we're doing Know Your Rights trainings, and I believe there's other people doing Know Your Rights trainings so that people will understand the law, because I think, well, in New York, New York City, I know you can get like up to a $250,000 fine for discriminating against a trans person. Your business could be charged. But right now, NYTAG is also, working on getting LGBTQI people, getting data on them, finding out how data is collected on LGBTQI people, who's collecting the data, how they're collecting the data, and if they're not doing it properly, we want to hold them accountable and show them how to collect data on LGBTQI people. It's very important. Funding issues and other issues, we need to know how identities are being, used, and if they're not being used, they need to get on board. Because we have non-binary, we have gender non-conforming, we have gender queer, we have trans queer, we have a lot of different identities that aren't on applications, and we want to see how organizations are collecting this data. This data is very important to us, and that's why we're raising money right now for that, so that we can get this information out and hold people accountable and make sure this data is being collected properly. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Tanya. Anybody things to add, or should we turn to another question? Another question?
We're celebrating 50 years of Stonewall this weekend, so homophobia is all gone in America, right? So what we may discover is that actually passing the legislation may be the easy part. Changing the culture is going to take a lot more work. And that's not only for us, it's for all of us here and our children to make sure that people understand who trans people are, what trans people need. The Governor's General Counsel is now going to HRC, so we look forward to the leadership of HRC to help. Alfonso David is a brilliant strategist who's a great partner here in New York State, and he'll be great at HRC.
Yes, he will.
Thank you both for that. Let's take one more question, and then we're going to gather socially. Anybody, one more question from the audience? Everybody must want to just gather. Well, I don't see any more questions, so I just want to thank the staff at HRC for helping organize this, and the LGBT Center of New York. So thank you to you. I want to offer a hearty thanks to the panelists today from SAGE and LinkedIn and ACLU and NYTAG. Thank you so much for being with us. This was a spectacular panel and very inspirational. Go ahead.
Thank you.
And I want to thank all of you in the room and around the country if you've joined us on social media. Please have a happy Pride. Please be safe, and please look to the future for being advocates for equality across this country, and particularly supporting the Equality Act in the future. Thank you so much.
Happy Pride.
Happy Pride, everyone.